This afternoon, I am sitting in the director's office of the Quinn Law Library of the University of Houston, talking with Spencer L. Simons, who is the library's director and the owner of this office, at least such as it is. And he is also an associate professor of law. Spencer, you have been the director here since 2004.
Right.
With that sort of by way of introduction, could we sort of start talking about you as a human being and normal type person as well as a law librarian? I think we're the same thing.
It'd be good to establish that first.
Yeah, well, could I ask you a little bit about yourself, perhaps?
Yeah.
What your life is like today and what it might have been even when you were young?
Yeah, I think I'll start with when I was young. I was born in Seattle in 1948. I was born in my dad's first year of medical school. Probably one of the few law library directors who ever lived in a public housing development, as my parents were students.
Union Bay Village, I
Yes, or
suspect.
Terrace, actually.
Yeah, I think they had a fancier name for it, but
Yeah.
that was built during World War II.
That's
to
correct.
house people working at this, what was then the Sandpoint Naval Air Station.
That's correct. Yeah, so my father went through the first, second year class in the medical school at the University of Washington. After he graduated, he owed some time to the Army. He'd been in the war, went through the GI Bill. So we lived at a couple of Army bases. And then in 1952, we moved to Baltimore. My dad was doing his residency at the University Hospital there. And we lived there for 5 years. In some way, those were the formative years of my life. My parents had one child after another, as was the practice at the time. And my father lived at the hospital for the most part, saw him a few nights a month. So I was, in some ways, those were my formative years, and that not just for the ages 5 to 9, but those were years when I took on a lot of responsibility. I was babysitting 3 children at a time when my mother went off shopping and other things at the age of 6. I was babysitting 3 children.
Times were different then.
Yeah.
Child Protective Services would be
Yeah,
allowed now.
these days we'd be in big trouble, but that was
Yeah,
the only
right.
option at that time. And also I had a lot of, when I wasn't babysitting my brothers and sisters, I had a great deal of freedom as a free-ranging child. I could go out in the morning and walk anywhere in Baltimore, essentially, and as long as I was home for dinner. So I developed a lot of independence at the same time, I think, without being excessively modest, quite a bit of responsibility. Also, although we didn't have any money, I didn't realize we were poor until I realized the other kids got more Christmas presents than I did. So I think I developed kind of my attitudes towards something frugality, economy, responsibility. I won't say leadership, but at least taking responsibility for others at quite an early age. So I think in some ways I was kind of predestined for something maybe like a directorship.
Sounds like the job description that directors have in our law libraries.
Right.
Make the best of the resources available and keep the staff motivated and as productive as they can be.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I think ordinarily that would be outside the scope of this, but I think it actually, as I thought about it, those were formative years, many years for me, many ways. And then in 1957, my dad finally, about the time I was about the age of 9, he was well into his 30s, had completed all his medical training and residency, and we moved back to Seattle, and where I'd been born. And at that time I became a thorough Northwesterner. I loved the Northwest. I was already kind of a free-ranging child, and I took all the advantages I could to wander through the wonderful Northwest woods and streams. And in the summer we'd go up to my aunt's, who lived up in a little logging town, and my brother and I would spend all day from first light to the end of the day out in the streams and the woods, fishing and walking and hiking. So I was a thoroughgoing Northwesterner very soon after we moved to Seattle. And in that own way, it's been formative as well.
I imagine the city in the area still has a bit of a tug on you.
Very
Down
much.
here in Houston, Texas, I think we call it, there's a name for it. At least I think, I've heard the name, called the Mount Rainier Syndrome.
I think I've got that, yeah.
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 Well, I certainly had grown up there too, and have it until I retired and moved back to that part of the
I
country.
expect to retire back to the Northwest eventually.
Yeah. Well, so this is sort of your life. Now you're here in Houston, and you've probably not given up all your fishing, although maybe you have.
Oh, I do some.
Excellent fishing down here too.
I do some. I especially like to go down to the bays
Uh-huh.
and put in my, it's not quite a kayak, kind of like a pirogue, and paddle around. If the fishing's good, I fish. If it's not, I paddle around and enjoy the scenery.
Uh-huh.
So there's a lot of very nice things in this part of the country.
Yeah, well, I remember that, and I used to actually go sailing with some faculty friends when I was here at the university,
Right.
out on whatever they call it out here between us and Galveston, Chip Channel, I know, but I don't know if it was there.
You're probably
or
thinking of
Bay.
the West Bay area. And
Probably,
yeah.
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 At least we didn't have to scrape all the petrochemicals off the boat when we came in.
No,
so-
actually, it's cleaner now, I think. Yeah.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Well, they've been working, I'm sure,
Yeah.
on that.
Yeah.
Mhm. Well, sort of to round you out, we've talked a little bit about, and I suspect one of your interests is the outdoors, but are there any hobbies, special passions, other special interests that you have that perhaps occupy time when you're not in here directing things in the library?
Well, this might sound obvious for a librarian, but I do a lot of reading. And especially I read, I guess you'd say widely, but I especially concentrate in history and biographies. Right now I'm particularly interested, there's been a large number of books out recently about our founding years of the country and about as the founding fathers. And I've been reading quite a few of those avidly. I've always had a strong interest in biology, so I keep up some reading in the natural sciences. And I guess just a lot of what you generally call general literature. I read a certain amount of fiction. And when I can't read, I try to read the New York Review of Books to catch up on what I don't have time to read. So that's, I'm not quite a homebody. I like to get out, but when I am home, I usually spend it reading something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I normally, at about this point in our conversations, start to focus on the person's career. And boy, have I got an interesting, different kind of question to ask you about that I think I've had in any of the 130 or so of these that I have been involved in up until now.
Right.
Because in your curriculum vitae or resume or whatever, you mentioned that at one time you started out as an instructor of fly fishing.
Yeah, that was an interesting.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, that was an interesting period in my life. Kind of skipping ahead a little bit, I had left my banking career by that point and was in a period when I was not a midlife crisis, but a midlife reevaluation period. And I had always been a fly fisherman. My father was from Missoula, my mother was from down the Bitterroot Valley in Montana. And when I was 6 years old, we flew back from Baltimore, and my father and grandfather took me fishing. And my first cast, I caught a fish. And from then on, I was hooked. And
So was the fish, I hope.
and so was the fish. And I'd been an eager fly fisherman all my life. As I said, in my early teens, we would go up and spend the summer at my great aunt's and be out all day, every day fishing. And then kind of got a little busier in law school, kind of dropped by the wayside for a little bit. Then in my early 30s, I decided to get serious and go from being just an avid fisherman to being a really competent fisherman. And fly fishing, of course, has got an endless amount of technique and skills to master. So I really worked on becoming a really expert fly fisherman, at least a competent fly fisherman during those years. And then I decided, when I had some time to kind of spread out, I decided to start teaching fly fishing classes. So I set them up at various places in the Seattle area, community colleges, adult education programs, the experimental college at the University of Washington. And I never really got into guiding. That was a little too much like babysitting. But I did a lot of classroom teaching.
You'd done that as a young kid.
Yeah, I'd already done that. But I did enjoy the teaching and sharing the knowledge. And an unanticipated really benefit was that when I came back into the academic environment and actually had classes to teach, I was already used to being in the classroom, and I kind of formulated my classroom technique and had gotten past the butterfly stage. So it was a lot of fun teaching it, but I also in fact turned out to be good preparation for my future as a law librarianship and a teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, teaching is teaching, I
Mhm.
suppose.
Right.
You know, we have a colleague who is, also has a little background like you, in the sense that it's Reba Turnquist, who is acquisitions librarian at the University of Washington in Seattle, and has been since before either one of us got into the field, and
Right.
she's still active. Reba, at least as a young woman, had grown up in Montana.
Mm-hmm.
And she used to go back on her vacations and fly fish in the rivers back, the Firehole River and others
I'll be
back
darned.
there. And she'd come back and tell tales of how awful it was. Her sleeping bag got burned with holes in it from
Right.
this, whatever was bubbling up underneath it in the ground.
Yeah.
But,
I remember Reba from when I was at the UW's library program very
yeah,
well. Yeah.
she's still there.
Right.
I have worked on her several times to see if I could get one of these little conversations on camera with her. But
I think you
she
should. Be
has
fascinating.
said she doesn't have anything to say, which I know is wrong, but you know, it's her call. So
Yeah.
so
I didn't know
far-
that background. That's more power to her.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
she was. I don't know if she still does it. She might. She's an interesting.
Pretty
lady.
lively gal. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe after all of this fun and games we've been through talking about fishing and that sort of thing, let's sort of now begin to focus more on your regular career.
Right.
And, should we start by, you've mentioned law degree.
Mhm.
Can you tell us about your academic background, the degrees you have and where you got
Yeah,
them?
yeah. Well, of course, I got my bachelor's degrees, 2 degrees, bachelor degrees from the University of Washington. And then some years later, not just a couple years later, 1974, I went back and started a JD MBA program. And I started out in the joint degree program. I anticipated even at that time I was quite likely, I felt, to go to the finance or business side. And I thought that was a natural way, and it worked out very well for me. The fact that I had that education was a big plus in helping me get my first professional job in the then Seafirst Bank. So that was.
So you really started off then with the Seattle First National Bank, or Seafirst,
That's
which is
right.
now I think part of Bank of America.
It is part of Bank of America. Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about that era in your working life?
Yeah, that was
Some of what you did and
Yeah, that was a fascinating era. I came into Seafirst in 1979. I was just out of school, and they gave me time to take my bar exam. Well, I was actually going to work as a banker, not as a counsel for the bank. At that time, I don't know if you recall, but that was a time of severe economic stress in this country. And the economy was weak with extremely high interest rates. And
early 80s or
yeah,
so.
late 70s. I started in
Yeah,
79.
that whole era was
That was just when Paul
very
Volcker.
different than we are used to more recently.
That was the era of stagflation, and then Paul
Yeah.
Volcker pushed interest rates up to 20%.
Yeah.
So there was not much lending for banks to do during that period, with one exception. And that was that there was a lot of, because of OPEC actions, which were related to the economic problems, there was a boom in oil and gas development during that time. So Seafirst had gone far afield. They'd founded an oil and gas department. They had a very entrepreneurial banker who was my boss shortly after I came to Seafirst. And he led Seafirst into a large, aggressive lending effort in Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. In fact, I first started traveling down to this area at that time as an oil and gas banker. And that was a time when we made a tremendous number of loans because there was a lot of opportunities, lending opportunities to be had. Unfortunately, my boss had somewhat rosy glasses, and he was a little more optimistic about certain lending opportunities than he probably should have been.
Yeah.
I had a very good career. I was kind of a natural for banking the way I thought, and I got along very well with the Texas, South, and the Louisiana and Oklahoma oilmen I dealt with. Some of them were famous, some of them were infamous, but somehow I had a certain knack of getting along with them. And so I had, my career went gangbusters. I got good promotions, I had large responsibility and portfolio. But over time I came to differ in my opinions from my boss's opinions about many of our loans. And fortunately, well, unfortunately for the bank, fortunately for me, it proved I was right before I had to leave.
Yeah.
So I became, basically, I was on the record as being against a number of problem loans. And everybody from my boss and up to the chairman of the board got fired.
Oh,
I stayed. I got a promotion and was sent to Oklahoma City with a team to help recover the money,
uh-huh.
workout team. And since I was the one with legal training, I was put in charge of the Chapter 11 bankruptcy portfolio. So I spent about 2.5 years in Oklahoma City doing nothing but working a number of oil and gas Chapter 11 bankruptcies. And that was something that was actually fascinating work. If you're ignoring the fact we were losing a lot of money, the work itself was fascinating.
Fortunately, it wasn't your personal
It was not my personal money. It was not my personal money. So that was a wonderful learning experience. I worked, of course, very closely with counsel, and if I can brag a little bit, at one point the counsel I worked with said, "Spencer, you might be the banker, but you're actually the best oil and gas lawyer in town." And I mean, the best oil and gas bankruptcy person in town. So it's not because you know the code, because I didn't really know the code. It says you understand the deal. And I think that was a lot of what I got out of banking. And I think that'll relate to a couple of things we'll talk about a little bit later. Was I developed a certain sense for the deal, and I also got a lot of experience in negotiating in difficult situations. So I ultimately, after that was kind of winding down, I went to another bank in Portland for about 2 years as well, in a general workout capacity. That means working with bad loan teams. And finally I realized I was kind of a foreign body in that place. This is a bank that had always hired everybody in high school, brought them up through the rest of their careers, and I was the first person to ever come in a high position with my experience. So I was not necessarily welcome to the long-time people.
You weren't one of the so-called old boys.
The old boys, yeah. So after 2 years, I realized it really wasn't a good fit for me. And I left, and at that point I decided I'd done a lot in banking and had done much of what I wanted to do. So I thought I'd take a little time and just think about things and do other things. Fortunately, I'd been so busy I'd saved my money instead of spending it during those years. So we took some time. I was married by that time. And we took some time and explored the fly fishing teaching
That was the fly
opportunities.
fishing
Yeah,
gig,
yeah. And I also just did a variety of kind of pickup jobs to pay the bills during that time. Then eventually, of course, that couldn't go on forever. It was a nice interlude. I got to
Sounds like it would be fun if it did.
Actually, those were rather pleasant years, I'll be honest, but you can't do that for your whole life. So at that time, one day I was sitting thinking as my arms were hurting from doing some laboring job I had. I thought, I can't do this forever. What am I going to do? I was about 45 by that time. And all of a sudden a light bulb went on. I said, I'll be a librarian. I never even thought about it before. And then I remembered that the University of Washington's law librarianship program, and I said, that's it. I'm going to go to the UW and go into law librarianship. So there was no decision. There was no real formative period on that. It just came to me.
So if I asked you if somebody had played a role in that,
No role at all.
You played your own role.
That's
in
right.
That.
So it just came to me. I went and talked to Penny Hazelton. I was kind of late in the year to get in that year, so I went and talked to Penny about what about the prospects in the profession. She was very encouraging.
I would think so.
Yeah. So I came in the following year, which would have been 94. Was when I started in Penny's program at the University of Washington.
So you went through that, and then after that, you were in Chicago.
I was in Chicago, right?
Chicago Kent.
That's right. My first job was at Chicago Kent.
Reference librarian, I believe.
That's how I started, yeah.
Yeah.
That was a very interesting experience. I doubt if that many people remember anymore. It's been a while, but at that time our boss was, the director was named Mickey Vogus.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And Mickey was a very interesting character.
Very much.
Yeah, and I would not recommend her, now that she's no longer director, I can say I would not recommend her model of library organization. but if you wanted to take advantage of it, you could learn a tremendous amount. She had a philosophy. First of all, she worked you very hard and had you heavily scheduled, which was fine with me. But also, she had also a philosophy that every librarian should be able to do everything in the library.
Well, it's not necessarily a bad philosophy.
No, it's not. I think it's an excellent philosophy.
Yeah.
So even though I was a research and reference librarian and a liaison to faculty, I also became, not too long after I came there, kind of the de facto head of cataloging for about 3 years, or 2 years. And I never became an expert cataloger. I'm not a cataloger in the sense that, say, Man Yin Lung is. But I learned a lot about it, and I learned quite a bit about technical services in general. Also, we rotated through ILL, so I got to do an ILL experience. You knew how circulation worked. Basically, all of those functions. I'd say the most interesting function I had there was as a protocol officer for the annual Consular Ball, which was our big gala to support the Library of International Relations. And each year, the Consular Corps of Chicago would be honored. So you would have about 70 consuls with their partner there. And in order to do it effectively, you had to not only know their names and who they were bringing in the correct pronunciation, but you also had to know their exact rank in the status order. So in order to get them marching in the correct order, you had to make a careful study of where they stood in the protocol order. And what made it interesting was inevitably some people didn't show up and sent their juniors at the time of the gala. So on the fly, while a bunch of consuls were walking around with drinks in their hand in the green room, you had to reorder and figure out who went before and after whom on the fly. And then I would sit with the master of ceremonies, who was usually a local TV announcer, and I would feed him the cards of who was walking onto the stage and whisper the correct pronunciation in his ear until the presentations, march and presentations were over. And then after that, I would go get a good stiff drink. Because that was
deserved it at that point.
That took a lot of concentration.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that was a very interesting job. You got exposure to a different, quite a different milieu than you ordinarily would. Yeah.
Now, while you were at Chicago Kent, you mentioned you got involved in, shall we say, a lot of other parts of the library, as well as some stuff on the outside that sounds a little unusual but interesting.
Yeah.
You became head of reference at some point.
That's correct. I guess it was about around 2000. I guess it was. That's right. Mickey Vogus had just retired, had left the directorship and gone to the faculty. And then the associate director had stepped up to the directorship, and the number two had stepped up, so I stepped up to become head of reference. And it wasn't too much of a shift for me. I was somewhat used to organizational operations. We were already a fairly regimented place with a fairly corporate style, which fit naturally with me. So I was
coming from the banking world, how corporate can you be?
That's exactly right. So in fact, I was probably more comfortable in the Chicago Kent business model library than many people would be. So stepping up into that position was a fairly natural step for me at that point. One thing that was interesting about the structure there was we put a lot of emphasis on project management. So formulating projects, planning projects, executing projects on a timeline with deadlines was an important part of our way of doing things. And I was already used to that by the time I became head of reference, so I was able to continue that process and the other sorts of things the head of reference does. It was actually quite a managerial function there, more than being, some places it's kind of the more senior reference librarian. There was more of a managerial role. Then in 2001, Keith Stuyvesant came.
Oh, yes.
And at that point, the person who had been the number two, who had been the interim director, moved over to another law school in town to assume a senior position. And I became essentially the number two position under Keith Stuyvesant. In other words, I basically was her associate director, not title, but in fact.
De facto.
De facto, yeah. years later, she said, Spencer was my first associate director. I said, well, Keith, you never gave me that title. But,
You know the day you got to make it official.
but that's what I was.
Yeah.
So, and in fact, this is jumping ahead a little bit, but in 2001, I think it was Philadelphia. I met John Schultz, who was looking for an associate director at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And I had just started working for Keith, and he asked me if I'd like to come down to Houston and be an associate director. He asked me if I'd like to apply for the job.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I'm working with Keith Stuyvesant now, and I'm learning a lot. Mm-hmm. And I said, rather than take that now, I'd recommend that you hire Michelle Wu. And I said, who's tremendous. And I knew that she was on his mind. Mm-hmm. So, and in fact, he did hire Michelle Wu, which was a very wise hire. She was a tremendous acting and then interim here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, she was a candidate some time back as a possible replacement for me, and didn't go that route, but she's now the director at Georgetown.
Yeah,
So
she's
she
had a
has
wonderful career. And
pretty significant day job as it is these
Right.
days.
That's right. Michelle and I were classmates at the University of Washington in 94, 95.
Yeah.
So
She's also one of the other two that do oral history
That's right.
conversations for this
right.
project. And
yeah,
it was a lot of fun to get to know her in connection with the work we're involved in together now. Yeah. Now, while you were at Chicago Kent, in addition to all these nice sort of fun things in the library, you were on the adjunct teaching faculty.
that's correct. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that, what you taught, and a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, I think one thing I thought I really appreciated about Chicago Kent was that they had opportunities for librarians to be adjunct faculty. They had an extensive second and third year legal research and writing program. In fact, all the students were required to essentially take legal research and writing throughout their 3 years. And the second year classes were taught by adjunct faculty, now many of whom were outside attorneys with specialties. So the model was to have kind of a standardized advanced legal research class, but to have an adjunct teaching with a focus on the specialty in which they practiced. And there were significant writing assignments that went along with the research instruction. So students would research in a specialized area. So I realized in my first year, I thought, well, I'd like to do this. And I realized that my specialty would obviously be bankruptcy. I'd had a lot of experience in that.
Yeah.
So I went to the then director of that program, Molly Lane, who was, I think, one of the best LRW heads around at that time. And I proposed this to her, and she said, yeah, you librarians are great adjuncts, and so we'd like to have you. So I put together a class. As we spoke earlier, Pat, putting together a class for the first time is the hardest part of every class.
It is
Yeah.
a bit difficult.
Yeah, so not only did I put together a class, but I basically sat down with the bankruptcy code and did some cramming before I went in, and I enjoyed that. By my second year, I was teaching as an adjunct. And then I taught usually one class a year, sometimes two. There were 3 credit classes. And for most of the time I was there, the last year I was there, I taught a drafting class. Molly said we'd like to experiment with not just legal research and writing classes, but kind of putting a large drafting component into it. So she asked me to put together the first drafting class they taught. And so I did that, and that was an interesting change of pace to move from thinking about a research-oriented model of legal writing to a more drafting-oriented, and then integrate it with kind of a practice orientation and the research as well. So that was a very interesting opportunity. So I taught there as an adjunct for 6 years, I guess. Now that was a big advantage. When I came to University of Houston, I had a teaching record, I had evaluations, and I had a lot of experience in the classroom. So I basically came with a class prepackaged and something to offer, and something measurable where they could tell that I could teach.
Yeah.
So that was I'm very glad I've had that opportunity, and I wish that it was possible for all new librarians everywhere to have that opportunity.
Different from
Yeah.
teaching fly fishing, I suspect.
Yeah, but being
In
in
some
the-
ways, maybe
Being
not
in the
so different.
classroom is surprisingly similar in the two situations, but, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, you had an interesting time at Chicago Ken,
Uh,
but you weren't to be kept in snowy old Chicago forever, so you decided to come south.
Yeah, and,
Talk about how all that occurred, because here you are.
yeah, I'd say about April, May maybe, of 2003, I got a call from Michelle Wu. And she was at that time the acting director here. And she said, Spencer, I said, they're looking for a director. I think I'm going to be moving on to another opportunity. Said, how'd you like to apply? Okay. So at the annual meeting, which was in Seattle that year, I met with the then dean and the rest of a search team, and we had a good meeting. So then they asked me to come down in early September to give a job talk and spend a day interviewing. And I came down, and after a sleepless night, went on to have a pretty good day, I think. During my job talk, I kind of set the theme for what I wanted to do at the school. I emphasized that I felt that the real salvation of the real purpose of a law library was service. And I also said that librarians are also teachers. And I said in addition to my teaching, I think our librarians should be in the classroom. I said I knew the way the LRW program was structured here, so that librarians were not in the classroom. But I said, ask your librarian to come to your class. If you're teaching insurance law, ask them to come and talk about the resources and techniques of doing research in your specialty. And interestingly, later that day, I was speaking with the then associate dean before meeting with the dean, and he said, what really impressed me was when you said a librarian could come to my class and talk about how to do insurance law research. I didn't know that was possible. So I said, yeah, that's exactly what we should be doing. And the faculty took to that very readily, but soon after I came, they were making a regular habit of inviting their liaisons to their classroom to give talks about resources and research techniques. And that's been a tremendous, I think, reputation builder for the library.
I would think so. I mean, the faculty will see you on a whole different level
Right.
As librarians and as support for what they're doing.
That's right.
They're that involved in it,
Yeah.
and a substantive as well as a more of a basic research type of fashion.
Not just fetching, but actually knowing something about and being able to teach. And actually, that's borne other fruit. In recent years, we introduced you over lunch. I think that's too personal for this interview, but I
No,
introduced you
you
to
did.
over lunch.
Unless it's bad about me, then I might flip it.
To some of our librarians, and we pointed out that two of our librarians have recently been asked to teach courses,
Yes.
advanced legal research courses in their specialty, one in taxation and one in health law. And again, that's a major gain that's come out of the fact that faculty have gotten to know our librarians so well and to see that they can teach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think in this time of which I've heard described as, from a budgetary standpoint, kind of trying times,
Yeah.
having the perception that the library brings more to the table than perhaps is usually perceived,
That's
it's
right.
not going to hurt you any.
That's what we really focused on throughout
Yeah.
my time here, has been new services and to faculty, also to students, and increasingly to the dean and the administration as well.
Well, you also are on the faculty, not as an adjunct these days, but as the real thing.
That's correct, yeah.
And, well, maybe adjuncts are the real thing too, but,
Yeah.
you get the idea.
Yeah, I was
You want to talk a
fortunate.
little bit about that aspect of your hats?
Yeah, I was fortunate. I was actually when we were talking about what terms they would hire me. The then dean said, well, you could come on as a tenure track, or you could come on as a contract basis. And I said, well, I'd like to come on a tenure track. He said, well, that'll be a lot of work. He said, you'll be teaching, you'll be expected to do research, do you want to take all that on? And I said, yeah, I think I have to. So I came here on a tenure track, and I was expected to teach 2 classes a year, in addition to my scholarly requirements. So in addition to the basically carrying over the class I was already teaching, was familiar with teaching, which is advanced legal research, I also started teaching a class called Accounting and Finance for Lawyers. And again, that built upon both my educational and my previous business experience. So I teach every year, every fall, I teach a 3-credit class, semester credit class in Accounting and Finance for Lawyers. And then every spring I teach a 3-credit class in basically advanced legal research, still with a focus on bankruptcy. I think students need to be able to have the experience of researching in a specialty where you can't get the answer just by going and looking for some cases or just by going and looking at the code. You really have to have a rigorous research process in order to not go badly awry in your process. So I've taught those classes throughout my time here. So I'm now in my 12th year. So I've taught each of them about 10, 11 or 12 times now. So I have about a 60% teaching load. I teach 6 credit hours a year.
Well, you have what all appears to be very excellent subordinates here. And,
Yeah, I'm very fortunate. I've got a good team.
That makes your job, so we say, all the more interesting, and that you can get involved in other things a little bit.
Yeah.
And yet keep the ship of state going in the right direction here in the library too.
Yeah, I keep my hand pretty heavily involved in the nuts and bolts around the library too, but I'm very fortunate to have an excellent team on both the technical side and on the research side, and I've got an extraordinary acting associate director, Miss Manyan Lung.
Yeah, well, she's been wonderful. She's helped set up some of my trip here to Houston for me on the the local end, and has been extremely helpful and friendly to me on this.
If anybody watching this video wants advice and success as a director, is get a really good associate director. Yeah.
And then we'll sort of take her name out so they won't know who here to contact. Is that how it works?
Right. Yeah. You can take that out if you want. Okay.
Yeah. Speaking of directors and some of the things that we sometimes take on, and actually other librarians do as well, you've been involved in some writing professionally, including books sort of aimed at directors and people who aspire perhaps to that. And with our old colleague and friend Michelle Wu.
That's correct, yeah.
Want to talk a little bit about some of those?
Yeah, again, since I came here on the tenure track, I was definitely expected to meet my scholarly requirements for both promotion and tenure. Usual 3-year, 6-year path. I started out writing an article which was published in the Journal of Legal Education, which I always felt was a rather elegant article, but had never been a highly cited article. But that was dealing with legal research technique and basically how to use process, how to use process in order to avoid the possibilities of going awry in the research process. Had a more elegant title. But, and then I got Michelle Wu contacted me. She was putting together a collection of writings by various directors on various topics, meant to be kind of a handbook for directors. Kind of similar to the one you had published some years before.
Back years ago. Certainly got the talent of the day involved in that.
Yeah, very similar book to yours.
Very doable.
Yeah, similar structure to your earlier book. Yeah. And she asked me if I would like to write about budgeting. Michelle asked if I would like to contribute a chapter to this handbook of writings by various directors, and I said sure. And she asked if I'd like to write about budgeting and finance, because that was kind of my specialty.
So the old banker.
Oh yeah, the old banker keeps coming back, yeah. So I did. I wrote a chapter about basically some basics of accounting, which I think everybody should have some fundamentals in, and then some kind of practical tips on budgeting. And I think that was a useful chapter. If interestingly, about 2 years ago, I was standing in line at a ALL function, and the person I was chatting with said, are you the guy who wrote the chapter on budgeting and accounting in Wu's book? And I said, yeah, you actually read that? He said, yeah. He said, we were assigned it in my library class. So it was nice to see that it was actually being used and assigned to the new candidates.
Your old professor up at the University of Washington, Penny Hazelton, used to assign the book I did.
Yeah. In fact,
20 or so years, almost 30 years ago.
we bought that. We bought that when I
Yeah.
went into the program. That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the deal was I didn't get royalties.
Oh.
The company got to keep whatever you guys
Oh.
pumped in, but that was the way it was, and I didn't have any regrets actually. I was
Yeah.
pleased people, one, had used the book and apparently found parts of it very useful, and two, knew who the heck I was in the right sense when I'd meet them at a meeting.
That's right. I knew your name from the book long before I met
Yeah.
you. So yeah, and then I wrote an article. Was probably the most significant of the articles I've written was an article about pros and cons of tenure for library directors. And that was published in the Journal of Legal Education. And the reason I wrote that was because this was a time when people were becoming very aware that more and more directors were not being offered tenure. And it was becoming viewed as something of a crisis in the profession. But I was hearing over and over again at directors' meetings simply the assertion we must have tenure. But I felt that that would, to deans and others, sound simply like special pleading if we didn't say why.
Yeah.
And too many of the reasons I heard were basically we need it because we need it, and not something that would be persuasive to deans or faculty.
Or that they could sell to faculty or
Right, exactly.
university provosts and
Yeah.
such.
So I decided I would just try to, without any bias, just go through and even-handedly sort out what the pros and cons were for each of the parties in the decision to give a director tenure or not. And I think it was an even-handed approach. I made a suggestion for kind of splitting the loaf in a sense. In other words, a tenure-like process, which I think does a lot of good for a director. I think for a director to have to go through a writing and a teaching proof period and to be approved by a faculty as in a sense, a peer is very valuable. But I was also aware that people were very concerned that they might get a tenured director whom they no longer wanted as a director at some point in the future.
Yeah.
And that was one of the main barrier to, I think, to granting tenure to some new directors.
Yeah, there's
So-
the flip side of that,
Yeah.
but I knew I encountered in early years when I was interviewing, and that is, how do we know if we tenure you eventually that you won't tell us someday you no longer want to be law librarian or law library director?
Yeah.
And, we need that, and this spot is for that.
Exactly right.
And I
Yeah.
said, well, I don't have any idea that I would ever do that. But I said, I can't guarantee reality, I guess, except
Right.
I don't intend to.
Yeah, and so they wanted to be sure that if you eventually were no longer the director, but you were still in the faculty, you could teach and you could write.
Yes.
Right. And I pointed out there was
Yeah, and they could come up with a tenure line or a budget line
right.
to hire another one to be
Exactly.
director.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So those were my considerations. So I argued there were strong virtues for both parties, but also burdens. And I suggested a model basically of what I called a rolling renewable contract, so that people misinterpreted it. They thought I meant presumptively renewable. I actually meant that if at any time you or the school decided you would no longer be a director, that you would then have maybe 2 to 3 years where you stayed on the faculty, where you could either search for new jobs or prove your way back into a true tenure position, to basically give people the flexibility to find a new career, and also basically to make the school think twice before they maybe took precipitous action. Maybe one dean didn't like somebody, you want to make them think twice before they tried to change the situation.
So it wasn't going to be the easiest decision that
Yeah.
you could make, yeah.
Right.
I hear you.
Yeah, so I thought it was a good solution, but I've never seen it widely adopted. Some people
There
took-
are a few
Yeah,
who
yeah.
have sort of continuous appointments.
Yeah.
One I remember was was like 6 years, so that wasn't the 3-year model, but it was
Yeah.
the same model, stretched out a tiny bit longer.
Right.
Yeah.
So, anyway, I found that, I think that in some ways was one of the biggest contributions I made, at least to that discussion, was that article.
Mhm.
Some people misinterpreted it. They thought I was arguing against tenure for directors. It was more that I was kind of recognizing that boat was already sailing and we had to find something
Yeah.
that was as
Well,
good
I
as
know
a substitute
that
as we
has
could.
been a potential controversial topic in our field
Right.
for many years. I mean,
Right.
in my own generation, it was
Mm,
perhaps less than it has become more recently, but
Right.
it was still there.
Yeah,
And we were always, something that faculty colleagues who were not administrators or directors or deans
right,
sometimes wondered. I mean, we weren't exactly the same thing they were. And
That's right.
What we did.
yeah. And it will be continuing tension, but, so, another writing, I was asked by Carolina Academic Press to write a book on Texas legal research. There's a series of state research books. The editor is Suzanne Rowe. And I was asked if I would write the Texas legal research book for that series, which I did. And then later on, the editor asked me if I would like to join as a co-author in a federal legal research book. And so I'm the second author in that. I've got 3 chapters in that and make some contributions to the others. So that federal legal research book has now gone into a second edition. We just completed that this last summer. And I'm currently about completed the second edition, which will come out next summer. And I've written recently one more small, it wasn't really a chapter, it was more like a contribution to another Wu edited book, another basically editor's handbook type of book. And recently,
There's a lot of ideas. And
Yeah.
she puts them
Yeah.
implements them.
yeah, and she lets other people bring their ideas out.
Oh, yeah.
It's been very good to know Michelle in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
My most recent publication was in the Law Library Journal.
Mm-hmm.
I co-edited and co-authored basically the edited remarks from the workshop for newer directors, which was at ALS last January. And that was stemmed out of a project originally by Joan Howland and Penny Hazelton. I was the director, as the head of the Committee for Libraries and Technology at ALS that year. So I worked with Penny and Joan, and we tweaked it quite a bit. I wanted to make it a little edgier to deal a little bit more with some of the more challenging issues in the profession. We actually had to put it off 1 year. I wound up being kind of the head for 1.5 years for technical reasons. And so I actually put together 2 annual workshops. One was a more general workshop. The other was one specifically for newer librarians. Although most of the librarians who came were not so new librarians, new directors. But it was a very productive. We had 10 of the most recognized, I think, experts in both law librarianship and legal education there, and I think it was a very productive conference.
That may be why you attracted some more seasoned learners than you realized you would from the director ranks.
Yeah. So that was a very good conference. I was pleased with it personally, and we had good remarks on it. And they say the editor remarks have just come out in the Law Library Journal.
Okay.
So,
Well, one of the advantages I have in retirement now that I really didn't have when I was active was the time to actually peruse the journal issues and read articles that catch
Right.
my fancy. That will be on my list. I have about 4 issues and sitting in we're in my family room right now waiting for me to finish perusing them, but that's because I've gotten bogged down on other little projects over the last few months.
Yeah.
But
Well, you'll know a lot of
keeping them until I read them.
yeah, you'll know a lot of the people in that article.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
Although I've been retired 12 years, so maybe they're all a whole new group coming along and some excellent people.
You'll know many of them, yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit of the future. Here I'm talking to a guy that's been basically somewhat on the cutting edge of responding to some of the issues and questions. that are coming up today that maybe didn't come up the same way a few years ago. And we're seeing a lot of change in not only legal literature, but our libraries that
Right.
reflect and meet the needs of the people that
Right.
have needs for access to
Right.
information of this sort. You want to talk a little bit about how you, as an academic director, very much a contemporary of this era, view some of these changes and perhaps what might be coming down the
Yeah,
road shortly?
Of course, the one that seemed paramount when I came in, and people still talk a lot about, is the balance between print and digital. That has moved a lot slower than everybody thought it was going to 20 years ago. We had a mixed model then, we have a mixed model now. The mix has changed. I no longer have print case books on my shelves, with a few exceptions. So we've all made decisions of that sort. But the reality is there are many forms in which print will still be desired or preferred, especially by the faculty. We're not going to move out of a mixed model anytime soon. But I think some of the bigger changes have not been actually in our collection choices, but in some of what I might call collateral damage that's come out of the digital revolution. And some recent developments have concerned me greatly about how the vendors are changing their views. I'm not going to name any vendors, but they're giving less support to the law schools now. It's clear that the law school, as the market for some of their products, is becoming less important to them. And in many cases, because of the budgetary pressures you mentioned, many of us have been forced to cut a lot of things in print that we carried traditionally print as a standard part of our collection. My concern is that now that so many of us have eliminated so many of what were staple parts of the print collection, that those who are now supplying, same publishers who are supplying the digital versions, will have too strong a hand. And I'm concerned that, especially now that they're less concerned about hanging on to the academic market for economic reasons, that they'll find it too easy to continue they'll be more reluctant to continue to supply us readily at reasonable prices the digital equivalents of the print parts of the collection we've already canceled. So I think a lot of people will be in a trap. They no longer have the print. All of a sudden, I think a lot of things we've gotten used to having relatively inexpensively may be offered a lot more expensively to us on an a la carte basis. And I think access to even basic legal information may become more difficult, or at least much more expensive for the library. Another thing I'm concerned about is whether the government will do its job in continuing in making digital legal information available digitally, predictably, and in an authoritative manner. I'm concerned when I see that, it hasn't happened yet, when the Congress doesn't think they can afford to fund FedSys, for example, and to maintain that, or when the FDLP, the GPO, may be so underfunded that it will no longer be able to not only continue its print services, but maybe not even be able to do a good job of making sure that government information is collected and made available in any format. So I'm concerned that the buy blows, in the sense of the digital revolution, will be the real uncertainty of access and the affordability of access. And if law schools have trouble getting it, it'll be a lot harder for a lot of other, for the general public, and for less funded institutions such as many county libraries, for example. So I think we're in danger of losing access. I'm not sure it's going to happen, but I think there's a risk of losing ready access to what should be readily available legal information.
I was on the other end when this was first beginning. Lexis came in the mid-70s. And by about the early 80s, Westlaw was established. And in those days, in order to promote the use of it in the future, they figured, well, the law students were the future. And so they came up with these arrangements
Right.
that even then were extremely desirable for us. And that evolved even in the course of my own career for another almost about 30 years almost,
Right.
well, close to 25 years.
Right.
And it always struck me that, you know, we were getting a lot more and more dependent on this stuff. We hadn't
Right.
yet, in my library, started discarding anything,
Mhm.
but the idea was certainly, we were looking at it. And I worried even at the time, I think many of us did, that what happens if things change and the eye of the beholder on the other side of this equation, this
Right.
continuum, and
Yeah.
suddenly we can't provide these, or we, you
Yeah.
know, have to really struggle to afford them.
Yeah, you know, one thing I always tell my accounting and finance students is the position you don't want to be in as a customer is to have only one or two suppliers or one or two customers.
That's right.
And we're in a position for too much of our information where we've only got one or two suppliers.
That's right.
And that makes us very vulnerable.
Well, of course, the law book market itself, even for long tradition, was, I suppose, not that large in terms of the number of lawyers. There were like 200,000 when I was really barred in the country, maybe 1 million
It's about 1 million now.
about now.
Yeah.
It's still not a huge market.
Right.
And so they had several publishers, but they didn't really compete in most cases like you would perhaps expect. They had products that worked together.
That's true.
They complemented each other, with a few exceptions.
Yeah.
But, so in a sense, we still were dealing with a relatively few suppliers that held a lot of the cards.
Yeah.
But, even more so, I suppose, today with the, you know, consolidations even of any of those companies, and
Yeah,
the
most
arrival of some new but big players in the mix too.
most of those companies you just mentioned have now been rolled into two companies.
That's right, one
And,
and two.
and in many cases, many of us in libraries have decided, partly because of space considerations, partly because the materials are becoming ever more expensive, that we can't afford for a variety of reasons to have that print, and we'll depend upon the electronic.
Yeah.
And I think we may get caught in that squeeze.
Well,
Yeah.
of course, we saw this even in my days of the commercial market, the law firms in downtown space and pricey cities,
Right.
making those same trade-offs,
Right.
getting rid of books and
Right.
relying solely on, basically on demand through Westlaw or some similar source when
True.
they had the need.
Yeah.
It's a new world and not one without its degree of
Yeah.
scariness, I
Yeah.
suppose.
And again, the uncertainty of the government interest in maintaining
Yeah.
really dependable and authoritative access.
Well,
I gotta say, I really appreciate Keith Stuyvesant's and Barbara Bentliff's efforts, if I'm allowed to mention names.
you may,
And,
especially in
yeah.
this context.
Yeah, and their efforts to ensure the availability of authoritative government information.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, times are changing, and you know, now that I'm retired, I can sit back and watch you guys all deal with it. I guess.
From a,
For whatever that's worth. Yeah. Well, Spencer, it's been delightful talking with you this afternoon. But before we end today's conversation, it's customary for me to ask if there's anything we have not talked about that you would like to bring up.
yeah, I don't think I've mentioned it, but I'd like to accentuate. I think that ever more in the future, I think our future, our survival in some cases, but our thriving will depend upon being ever more innovative and in our efforts to develop and deliver services. And that's been my thrust ever since I've been here, having more liaison librarians, having them do more for the faculty, extending our reach to the students in a variety of ways, extending our reach to the clinics, which were tended to be kind of on the periphery before, and in my recent thrust.
Competing with the library
Yeah.
for fiscal resources.
That's also, yeah.
Yeah.
But a lot more teamwork in that respect as well. But And also I'm focusing, and this is one of the things I spoke about at that ALS meeting in January, was I think it's going to be ever more important that we not just be contributing to the law school, but that we be visibly contributing as far as the dean can see. You know, the dean might know, the faculty says, the librarians are doing great things for me, that's great. But I think the more you can do for the dean directly, the more credibility you're going to have with a guy who writes the bills and keeps and allocate your budget.
It has to go to the central administration
Yeah.
and justify all the requests and
Yeah.
prioritize them first.
Yeah, we think we're understrained. They're really understrained.
Yes.
And the more we can help them meet the demands on them, I think the more successful we will be. So that's an area where I really put up my emphasis in recent years, is on giving the dean excellent service. We've got lots of capacities, and we have lots of ways we can develop information and perform necessary services for them that sometimes other people in the law school can't. So I think that's an essential part of our future success. And finally, I'd just like to reiterate, I think for everybody who's considering being a director, I think it's really important that you teach and that you write. I know that I've heard, and this is anecdotal, but I've heard that in some cases, people who are seeking directorships now don't particularly want to teach and write. It's burdensome, but I think it's absolutely essential to our credibility and the success of our libraries, is that we are seen by the dean and the faculty as being somebody who can do what they do, which is teach and write. So,
I've heard the same sentiments and from both sides of the issue during many of these conversations, and sometimes more off the record, off camera. But it is obviously a huge concern in the academic end of our profession, at least.
right.
Yeah.
You know, one thing more I might like to say, if I can go on.
Well, please.
I think we're going to have to explore new areas in which we can teach and to contribute to the law school. Now that there's a greater emphasis on teaching and assessment and in skills practice, I think now is the time for us to exploit some of our skills and develop, I should say, new skills, but ones that we build on things that come naturally to us. And that is, I think there's a real opportunity to forge ahead in teaching in the law school such things as library practice technology. We tend to teach research technology and some general technology, but there's an awful lot of things. In fact, the big vendors are putting a lot more effort into developing the technology for legal practice process. And I think if we get to understand that, and we can teach that, at least the basics of it, to our students, we'll be serving that need for skills development and practical experiential skills, and better preparing them for practice, which is just what the law schools are going to need. So I think it's a real opportunity for the law school, for the law libraries in that respect.
Well, given the fact that so much is changing in the academy, and especially in legal education, and in the practice of law, and has changed.
Right.
Sounds like you have, you predict that we need to move with the times. I think that's one easy way of saying,
That's right.
summing up what you just said.
Exactly right. We're going to have to keep on ahead of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very good.
Yeah.
Well, with that, I want to thank you, Spencer Simons, for taking this time this afternoon. What you have said, I think, is going to be a very important contribution to our history, and I appreciate your willingness to do it, be part of this. And in thanking you, of course, I'm thanking you on behalf of somebody we've talked about off and on this afternoon, Michelle Wu, and also Frank Hodek and Dick Spinelli, our colleagues with whom I have the pleasure of working to develop this oral history of law librarianship for the Spinelli Law Library Reference Shelf section of Hein Online. Thank you.
Well, it's been a pleasure.